Eleanor Morris, and I work for the Nature Conservancy's Global Conservation Campaigns team, which means I work with the Nature Conservancy chapters and our partners all across the U.S. on public funding, either through legislative initiatives or through ballot measures going right to the voters. And for these two campaigns in Colorado in 2020, I worked on the coalition at the front end to help figure out what the package looked like, what funding was going to go to, and then on the campaign side, once we were on the ballot, making sure we're communicating to our voters, getting our voters to turn out, and we're getting to our 50+1 so we can win on election day. The goal in my mind with doing financial feasibility research is to get all the facts out in one place so that ultimately your coalition can compare apples to apples about what funding mechanisms are possible. And when doing that and looking at the funding mechanisms, there's really 5 key elements that you want to have in that research. The first, obviously, is what are the public funding mechanisms that are legally viable? How much money would that raise? Who pays it and how much? And what are any limits to an individual funding mechanism? For example, bonds can only be used for capital expenses. So if your need is around maintenance or stewardship, a bond is not going to be the right fit for what you're looking for. So that's the kind of information you want to uncover in that section. The other 4 things you want to look at is the financial status of your community. Does the jurisdiction carry a large debt load? What are the other competing needs in your community, whether that be roads or schools or libraries? Then you want to look at equity. Who pays the tax that you're exploring? Is it borne equally across a population, or is it carried disproportionately by historically marginalized populations? Is there a more equitable funding mechanism that you might look at that distributes the burden more appropriately? You want to look at procedures because the last thing you want to do is think that all we have to do is get the elected officials to vote yes and then realize you have to go to the ballot measure, because each funding mechanism might have different ways that it can be implemented. So you want to make sure you understand the process and the timeline for that. And then lastly, you want to look at election history for your community. Understanding, does your community vote on ballot measures for funding different things in your community frequently? If so, what is the result of that? Is your community used to voting yes for these things? That can give you a sense of the viability of each funding mechanism. That's all the facts that you want combined in a financial feasibility report. What I love about doing financial feasibility research is that there's no magic to it, so you don't really need to reinvent the wheel. So the first place I start to look is at your neighboring communities. Lots of communities have raised funding for conservation. So let's see what your communities have done. You can look at other neighboring states as well. I would offer one caution, though, is that each state has different laws about how local communities can tax their citizens and what that funding can go to. So if you might see something in another state, you want to look at it, but you can't, that's not a guarantee that that can happen in your state. So really, I just look at the local communities neighboring to wherever I'm trying to work. At the broader picture, this is really working with either local legal counsel, your local government, and they really have all this information. It's a matter of teasing it out and getting it out on paper so that you have all the facts, all the information ultimately to make a decision. So as I mentioned, the financial feasibility research is just the facts, and the goal is that you can compare different funding mechanisms as much as possible as apples to apples. I also really think of this as more than just a report with the information on it. It's a decision-making tool for your coalition. It's almost to avoid the situation of where you've picked a funding mechanism and you're on the ballot and you're going for it, and you have someone say, well, why didn't you do this mechanism, or why didn't you do that? Having a financial feasibility report gives you something you can point back to and say, here are the reasons we chose this funding and here are the reasons we did not choose another funding mechanism. So it gives you that support and justification for the decisions you make so that people can't second guess you later. And I really think at this is a little bit where the art of all of this work comes in as well. You have the facts, and then layering in a different funding mechanism might bring in supporters or might bring in opposition. And that's an important thing to consider when looking at it. It's a much more subjective element than just the facts. And that's why it's part of the decision-making process, and you don't include that information in the report itself. So I would really think of it as use that research as your decision-making tool for your coalition. And then so you can explain the decisions you've made to elected officials or to voters or to supporters to help them feel really confident in ultimately